And this is the
Sure.
same with freedom of speech today. Freedom of speech means I get to do a Heil Hitler salute. And if you say anything bad about me after that, then you're impinging upon my freedom of speech.
So in this sense, freedom is not about the absence of limits, but it's the ability to engage with and integrate them meaningfully into your life. So for example, a process of learning a new skill, like playing a musical instrument or developing a healthier routine, right? The kind of habit we might want to cultivate to be better, shows how freedom emerges through navigating and internalizing constraints.
Suppose there's like an initial state of nothing, pure zero, not the nothing of negation, but just pure zero nothing. We have this limiting of a limitless freedom, of a boundless potentiality into a freedom for potentiality of this or that.
All these freedoms we call them freedoms, but they do not have positive content because they are actually negations. They are restrictions on the state. But the reason I think this works so well as a floating signifier is that it doesn't have positive content.
Just
all right, you guys good?
Yep, looks good.
I think so.
The
right.
waveform is flowing, baby.
Hey out there, listeners. Wave goes in, wave goes out. I'm in your ears. I'm with Eric. Hey, Eric.
Hello.
And Victor.
Yo.
I thought it would be, it's not something I necessarily want to talk about, but I thought it'd be more weird to pretend like America isn't happening this week than to acknowledge it. So if we could just quickly acknowledge it. This is the timeline. I didn't see all the headlines, but I saw Trump is president. Elon Musk is lying about cheating at video games and hiling Trump, and the ADL said no, hiling, that's fine now. That's the world this week. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I mean, Trump's back.
God.
He's back. I haven't really mercifully, I don't know. I've just been too preoccupied with other stuff that I just haven't been paying that much attention to the Trump inauguration, but I've caught a few tidbits here and there, and I quite enjoyed an interaction he had with a journalist about NATO and NATO spending. I don't know if you guys saw it, but I think someone asked him, what are you thinking about countries in NATO that aren't paying their fair share for like defense contracts, and in particular Spain? Spain only spends, and then Trump was like, oh yeah, Spain, they're basically getting away from free, and they're a BRICS country. It's like, what BRICS is, right? He's like, and the guy's like, what? And the journalist is literally like, what? And he's like, BRICS. He's like, they're a BRICS country, of course. So like,
Spain's
it's like,
BRICS,
and just by the way, for the listener, in case it's not obvious, like Spain is definitely not in the BRICS. And I think that there's something.
It is. It's Belgium, Romania.
yeah.
Actually, India is.
Italy.
And Spain.
Spain, yeah. So,
yeah, that's the S.
Canada is the C.
Spain,
Canada,
and Canada. That's
Spain,
why
yeah.
that's why he's going to impose a 25% tariff on Canada, because we're a BRICS country. So right away I was like, oh great, it's a nice reminder of like how poorly informed Trump really is. Like right away, right off the bat, he says something that's just patently false. And in moments like that, I'm kind of like, I'm old enough, and you guys are probably old enough to remember when everyone used to mock George W. Bush for being an idiot. But I actually more and more, obviously it's just, part of it's just comparative, but part of it is I realized that that if anything, Bush was more performing stupidity to like appeal to his base, but I don't actually think that he was that dumb. I mean, this is real dumb. This is a real like lack of information, like lack of understanding of basic geopolitical concepts. So yeah.
Well, I must say
observation.
I glance at the news every now and then, but I'm finding it much easier this time around. In 2016, I was like glued to the fucking news, but this time it's so much easier just to be like, okay, I feel like I know how this is gonna go.
Yeah,
I'm still gonna like keep up with things, but I'm not gonna do the 2016 what the fuck's gonna happen today kind of anxiety thing. I'm just gonna be like, all right, just let it wash over me.
It kind of just feels like first is tragedy, then is farce. It's just farce this time. So it's like,
yeah, I mean, we need another saying. First is farce, and now is just theater of the absurd. I don't know.
Yeah.
It needs to go deeper.
It seems like it could be more dangerous this time around. Like there's an emboldening there.
Yeah,
It could
they
be
learned from their mistakes, and now they're gonna make sure the right people are in the right positions and they can take down what they want. Trump just withdrew from the World Health Organization, which is surprising.
Is it surprising?
Well, I don't know. Yeah, no, it's not on one level, but in another level, it's like a big, surprising move, I guess. Like, didn't know what he was going to do.
And he pardoned all the January 6th people. He pardoned our favorite QAnon shaman, who said he's going to go and buy a gun now.
Oh, perfect.
That is perfect. Well, you know what? Paying attention to it or not paying attention to it, and I would say this generally speaking for everyone, whether you pay attention to it or not doesn't really make a difference. Well, my favorite thing that he did was, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, signed an executive order mandating that government architecture has to be classical. So what do you think that means? Because it's stipulated.
Classical as in Greek, or classical as in like neo-colonial?
Well, probably just classical, like all those other buildings in Washington.
I'm glad you asked, because if I'm not mistaken, I think most of Washington is neoclassical, which is like Greek revival. But when this executive order says classical, it includes neoclassicism, the Georgian style, the Greek revival, and Gothicism. So just whatever you have that's old, as long as it's prior to modernist architecture, it's allowed.
And European.
Just like greatest hits minus Rococo.
Yeah, I guess you cut it off.
Baroque.
At anything before Art Deco is okay. But this is perfect for like America, which is a simulation of legitimacy. This is like fake old is the thing that's now allowed. Not the architectural styles that were actually developed in the country. No, just the imported ones simulating a past.
Well, what was even developed in the country? I guess like anything modernist. But I mean, was there also some kind of, don't they have some kind of colonial architecture that's sort of associated with America, that like a lot of buildings at like Harvard are like colonial? I don't know.
Well, the columns, I think the columns are mostly Greek revival.
I was going to ask the big columns with the colonial square in front.
Those are Greek revival, but I thought that there's also like a more muted architecture that some people call like American colonial or something. I don't know, but that's obviously just European stuff anyway.
That's why I asked if that was classical, because even when I went down to Mexico and saw like Cortez's house and stuff, that's all like kind of colonial style as well.
I just like that Gothic is thrown in with like Greek revival. These are from 300 years apart, even in their original iterations, and then they're allowed to be revived, and only them. How insane will it go? That's what we're all wondering, but that's not what we're talking about today.
Well, I like, what about the Zig Heil? Elon Musk Zig Heil. I mean, do you guys have strong opinions?
It wasn't Nazism, it was autism. They're easily confused.
Yeah, what do you think?
He's just waving.
I don't know.
I think the most likely, I don't think he's like got, real Nazi sympathies, but if anything, his goal is to make people mad.
Yeah.
But it also, if you watch it, it didn't really seem like he was thinking it through. It seemed more kind of spur of the moment. I just wish that we could take away the power from images like that so we wouldn't have to focus on that bullshit, because really it's a smokescreen for what the administration's real goals are.
Well, I think the real goals do align with doing a Nazi salute and then claiming it wasn't a Nazi salute. That's kind of been the MO of Republicans for a long time, coded racism.
And it works so well, because then the liberal media goes crazy and like gets the exact reaction that they want. That's the thing that like I found it's kind of like a double bind, that it's like you have no option for how to react to it, because like if you think that it's a purposeful Nazi salute, then you just end up being that liberal or lefty who just points Nazi and just plays into their hands in some other way. Or you just like stay silent, or I don't know. It's one thing that was funny though, was to see Nick Fuentes, who's like, clearly a white nationalist, be like, on his stream, like laughing about how like that was just an unambiguous like Roman Nazi salute. Like that was, he was like, oh man, he's like, that was just like a I love Hitler moment.
Well, Hitler did like take a like pastiche of things, right? Like, you know, the Buddhist symbol, the Roman salute, like, and Hitler was also a classicist himself.
I looked this up. Apparently, there's no evidence that the real Romans did that salute. That this was like taken from some like play or movie where like some playwright,
probably
like
Ben-Hur.
yeah,
It sounds about right.
yeah.
I think I would like to
Artistic
take
license.
I would like to take a deflationary stance towards the Nazi salute, because he's just getting the reaction that he wants, whether or
Exactly.
not he has Nazi
Yeah.
sympathies. And insofar as he does or does not have Nazi sympathies, what he cares more about than any Nazism is pissing off the people that got pissed off. So
Yeah.
he won.
Yeah, because the conservative and liberal spheres are so separate too. It's like, yeah, you push the buttons of the liberal sphere, they react. The conservative sphere claims nothing wrong happened, and look at this reaction they're having. They're lying about us. They're painting us as evil. It's like they just have this system going of making them react, and then claiming they're reacting over nothing, and then, oh, look how terrible the liberal press is, full of lies.
I will admit that I am surprised, and maybe I should be embarrassed that I'm surprised, but I'm surprised the ADL was like, no, that's fine.
Wait, who's the ADL?
The Anti-Defamation League.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, they came out and said they didn't think that that was a Nazi salute.
Nope, they said he's a great friend to Israel, so there's no way he could be a Nazi.
Oh, that's a whole other can of worms.
Okay.
Are those two things mutually exclusive?
That's
Close up-
funny, yeah.
Close up the can now that we have video. Okay,
Yeah.
put it over there. That's our news update. If it gets, we're gonna have to come back touchstone, but we're dealing with something else. Same thing we did last week, and though today's format, it's gonna be a little different than normal because we did some homework. We're gonna be throwing our ideas into the battle ring, and the fight is over freedom. We have to find out if it means something. It's a big concept in many kinds of philosophy for many centuries of philosophy. It's a religious concept. It's a bunch of concepts. But we wanted to figure out what freedom is because over the summer, we were looking into and researching the religious origins of society. And religion, if you weren't there, religion doesn't mean any particular religion. It just means the chain of symbols and signs that people metaphorically gather around. And it's not also the case that wokeism is a religion. Nothing like that. We mean gathering around signs, totems, what makes a society, and they need to be at least looking in the same direction once in a while to be considered part of the same social
Wait, are there
system.
not totems in wokeism, though, that would qualify also, potentially?
Well, they wouldn't be the society that adheres to them would be very small. So it's not like America is woke or the university is woke, because it's a minority view at best. And then the minority view gets, I'll explain this, I think. You turn a group of people into a crowd using a totem. This is Durkheim's theory. They identify with the totem, and that creates enemies out of everyone who is not facing the same direction as you, or potential enemies. Not everyone is straight up an enemy, but if they're not facing the same totem, they become a potential enemy to your group. So we came to the conclusion over the summer that if we have a totem socially, the West, the left, the right, the Trumpist, the Marxist, everyone agrees that they want to be free, right? So in that case, our totem would be something like freedom and whatever that means.
Yeah, just not to, but I guess I'm just curious, like just reminding myself of this account. But there can be, so yeah, I get that. Like, I think the reason why freedom is such a compelling totem is because it doesn't matter what your political persuasion is, right? Like everyone seems to accept some version of it, or at least speak to it.
No one will say like freedom, I don't want that. Everyone will say freedom, yes, I want that.
Nah, not for me.
Yeah, not for me. Exactly. And I think that's why it makes it such a compelling totem. So yeah, I agree. I guess just like on the wokeism or even other subcultural examples, I guess the reason that stuck in my head is because I am currently like applying for jobs, right? And I'm thinking about like having to write diversity statement. And I don't know, that just seems like some kind of a totem or something. I don't know. It's just like some kind of like a compelled thing that I have to do that like feels like an ideological like bow. I don't know, like showing that you're on the same team, basically.
I agree with that, but the problem is if we're dealing with like these micro totems, and there are
micro totems is the word I was looking for. Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Which is not a term that exists in the literature; it's one we just invented. But if you want micro totems, you have totems down to the level of the family and your friends group.
Right.
But if we're speaking of a cultural totem, then we have to find the things that we agree with the Trumpists on.
Yes, exactly. No, that makes perfect sense to me, which is why I started by saying freedom's like a perfect example, because like no one says no to it, pretty much. I mean, pretty much no one says no to it. Yeah, good.
And fun fact, I was just looking up like what the ancient Greek word for freedom is, and it's personified, of course, as a goddess, Eleutheria. And so the ancient Greeks had this concept of freedom, but it belongs to the gods. Like the gods are free, and humans are sort of fated to, if you've seen Greek tragedy, right? The gods are sort of always guiding the principal human characters towards their fate, which is kind of this ineluctable, unavoidable outcome of the tragedies, which is usually death and misery for all. But yeah, Eleutheria.
You are stepping on my toes here, Eric, because I'm going
Primer.
third, and I will present the semiotic philosophy of language of what I think freedom is. Then, before me, we'll have Eric give a Peircean semiotic view of what freedom is, or maybe it's not semiotic.
It doesn't touch on semiotics too much, but I'll try to make the connection if I have time.
But first, we are going to hand it over to Victor. Victor has chosen to take on the existentialist / phenomenological account of freedom. So that will be the order. We said in the rules that we have 10 minutes each, but let's stick to it as well as it works to
I mean, I should be able to be pretty brief. I did actually prepare some writing, actually, like full disclosure. This was the first time I've ever done this, and I found it actually to be quite useful, which was I kind of had some rough notes. And then I was like, you know what, I'm going to put them into ChatGPT, and I actually ended up having a back and forth because I wanted to, and I've never like done this extensive of a back and forth conversation with ChatGPT, but I felt like it really helped me actually clarify like what I wanted to say, what I wanted to include in my account of freedom. So some of this is like reworded my words from ChatGPT, but I'm not really necessarily going to read it verbatim, but I do kind of have the overall view that I want to advance. And I think this view is probably the one that's maybe closest to the commonsensical view of like what a everyday Joe would think is freedom. So I'm going to try to defend it from kind of an existentialist perspective. Okay, so I think on this account, a crucial starting point is that it's not about the metaphysical debate about whether objective free will exists. Instead, I'm concerned with a lived, embodied sense of ownership over my habits, dispositions, and tendencies. So to feel free is to feel that one's actions, desires, and self-conception are aligned, that one's life is genuinely one's own. So this sense of ownership is not a static or given, but I think it's cultivated through moments of growth, reflection, and deliberate effort to reshape our own habits or tendencies and to reflect things that we kind of have higher order desires for. You know, I want to be better at this thing. So I think Merleau Ponty is useful here because of his account of embodiment. So freedom is not purely a matter of intellectual deliberation, but it's enacted through our bodies and lived experience. So, for example, a process of learning a new skill, like playing a musical instrument or developing a healthier routine, right? The kind of habit we might want to cultivate to be better, shows how freedom emerges through navigating and internalizing constraints. So at first, the rules and techniques, are discomforting. We start to exercise, it sucks. But over time, you can become a sense of kind of fluidity and mastery. It can get to the point where it becomes so habitual that it feels weird not to do this thing, right? It feels weird to not exercise. So in this sense, freedom is not about the absence of limits, but it's the ability to engage with and integrate them meaningfully into your life. So moments when we push ourselves closer to this alignment, when we develop a better habit, we overcome a limiting tendency or make a deliberate change, that feels, I think, especially freeing. Those are moments when we feel most free. These are moments of progress in integrating who we are with what we aspire to be. So, I think another example, we're distracted too much. We're endlessly scrolling online, but maybe we shift that to reading more, to being more creative, to reinforcing, these more deliberative or thought-provoking habits, as opposed to just going with the flow. So in this sense, I think we can understand it as a practice, and a process of striving, rather than a destination. So again, I want to return to this point about like, how does this cohere with kind of a objective free will? So on this view, it doesn't depend. We actually don't care about objective free will. In fact, the notion of absolute freedom, I would claim, like, for example, the ability to choose every thought that comes into my mind, right? I think Nietzsche points this out in one of his books, would be horrible. It's undesirable, impractical, the idea that every single thought. So instead, freedom is situated, partial, emerging from a tension between our given circumstances and our efforts to take ownership of them. So even in constrained conditions, there's always room to push, to strive for a stronger sense of ownership. So that's like the basic account I have. But I kind of also had this example that was maybe anticipating things that I thought potentially pills would bring up, maybe. Because I think consumer culture, I know we've talked about consumer culture a lot. Critiques that maybe come from people like Baudrillard argue that like consumer culture, these other things, they script our desires and our subjectivities, right? Reducing freedom to kind of illusory choices offered by markets and media. So while this critique highlights, I think, real influences, I guess I want to say from an existentialist perspective, the presence of consumer culture does not negate freedom. It simply becomes another domain where the challenge of ownership arises. And I think here Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith can be useful. Bad faith occurs when individuals evade responsibility for their freedom, passively adopting roles, values, and desires as if they were externally imposed. So in the context of consumer culture, bad faith manifests when people uncritically absorb narratives and advertising. And, to some extent, I think on the existentialist view, we all do this to some extent. We're all shaped by these things. But I guess I want to say that there's a way in which you can take up an attitude and take ownership of those things, even though they're kind of imposed, because it's just like everything else, just like our body, just like the culture, the family we're born into. We didn't choose these things. We don't choose the consumer culture, but we can still choose a way to react to them, I think is what I want to say. So we can reframe consumer culture as just another site of struggle, just like the struggle with our bodies, our bodily constraints, that undeniably shapes us, but it also offers opportunities for engagement, right? We can be, a connoisseur of eating McDonald's or something like that, right? We can try to adopt a different attitude to it. That still, I think, takes up the existentialist ethos. And then I guess the last thing, I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I guess the last thing I wanted to touch on was maybe some of the political implications of this. So, when applied to a political realm, I think this view suggests a preference for systems that expand the horizon of freedom to create conditions where individuals can pursue ownership in diverse and personal ways. So such systems respect and support idiosyncrasies of individual preferences, individual tendencies. And I think this perspective also recognizes subtle, pervasive systems of oppression often constrain freedom. It acknowledges the way cultural value patterns, as I said before, consumer culture can, seemingly limit people. But I think for existentialism, addressing these constraints involves, trying to point to point to systemic barriers. I know Simone de Beauvoir talks a lot about the way feminism does this, is trying to expand the horizon of freedom for women. But I still think it's important to acknowledge that I don't think existentialism actually, strongly asserts one political system over another. I think, one thing I wanted to add was just that I think that, on an existentialist account of that I was talking about earlier, of kind of like the way that we feel free when we exert ourselves, when we push past something, I think in some ways this question of the kind of political freedom we want gets complicated, because I think from this account we can understand why authoritarian systems can be kind of appealing, because they often narrow the scope of choices, compelling individuals to act in specific ways. This narrowing of options can paradoxically foster a sense of freedom, as people are forced to exert themselves in certain ways. And I think, thinking back to the last episode, we can remember Sartre's provocative remark that the French were never as free as under occupation. I think under the constraints of occupation, the act of resisting oppression required individuals to exercise their freedom through defiance, giving them a heightened sense of purpose and ownership. So by contrast, in societies with expansive freedoms, individuals often face an overwhelming abundance of choices, or, the illusion of choices from consumer culture, these different messages. And I think this can lead to alienation and paralysis as people struggle to navigate that. Yet from an existentialist perspective, this ambiguity and difficulty of navigating broad horizons of freedom is, I would still argue, preferable to the artificial clarity imposed by oppression or authoritarianism. That's kind of how I see that dynamic. And I think those are like the main comments I wanted to make. So, yeah.
Okay. I have some clarification questions that are not criticism questions.
Mm-hmm.
So you're kind of saying the least free person is the reactive one. And I wanted to know.
It's about a subjective feeling too. So
right. So this is my question for clarification, because of where you started and where you ended up. You said freedom is more physical than mental, or is it mental too, but there's conscious choices? So how does
it's both, I think.
How does the embodied part relate to thinking about freedom? I know where you're getting it from, but I don't know if everyone else will.
Yeah. So I would say that, like, on my view, on this view, I mean, it's not really my view. It's really Merleau Ponty's, and to some extent Sartre and these other existentialists' view. I mean, there is no division between the mind and the body. I think like Merleau Ponty repeatedly says that, like, an embodied attitude, a mental attitude, is actually an embodied attitude, that, like, there is no separation. But I guess I just wanted to emphasize it kind of in a commonsensical way, that we're not really talking about this kind of purely mental activity. We're talking about changing our attitudes to things in an embodied way. And I think the reason why it's important to bring up embodiment is because, the body, I think there's somehow this, like, subjective sense or illusion that, like, our mind is this realm of freedom because we can think about whatever we want, or at least it seems like we can. But then our body is like this barrier, this limitation. It's like, I have to push myself to do these things. And I guess I just want to say it's one and the same thing, because all of it is actually limited and contextual and partial. And it's all part of one system, I think. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's...
Yeah, that's the other thing that I wanted to clarify that I got out of what you said is the normal definition of freedom often is like an absence of limits.
Yeah.
This one is having limits, but almost being aware of them and then being able to choose and break the ones that aren't working.
As best you can. Yeah. And it's about the subjective feeling that follows from when you are like, holy shit, I had to push myself to do this. And it doesn't matter what the objective truth of the matter is. It's about what it feels like when you do it. And I think commonsensically everyone can identify with that feeling when we've overcome something. And I think that's freedom.
Mm.
Do you have any questions, Eric?
Yeah, I would just sort of ask the basic question Sartre would get asked is, so if all freedom is to choose, and choosing is good, then any choice you make is good, send them to the gulags because I'm choosing to bring about communism, or something like that. So, which to most people would be bad.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that would be bad. I mean, I don't think that there is like a clear answer. I mean, I think that Simone de Beauvoir has a much better account of ethics in The Ethics of Ambiguity, which I think we did read, which still leaves some questions unanswered. But if I recall, I mean, I think that the existentialists would be quick to point out that the thing that's kind of scary about like objective, kind of unambiguous moral systems is that it's actually like the Kantian person or something who, well, I've followed the rules, so now I can do anything that's outside of those rules, right? Now I can do anything that conforms to those. Or like, you know, the utilitarian who's like, well, this is maximizing happiness, so I'm going to do this thing. It's it kind of the certainty that those systems grant is the scary thing, I think, from an existentialist perspective, because from an existentialist perspective, it's all about ambiguity. It's all about the you don't know. You have to take, it's scary. Every choice you make, there's like the consequences of it are the weight of the consequences of it when you're kind of in your best moments of reflection should cause you to think twice about the choices that you make because there are no certainties, I think.
It seems to me like the Sartrean position, it requires so much thinking and evaluating and reflecting and being like, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. Whereas the Merleau Pontian thing, it's like for him, the artist is much more free with a pencil than someone who's not an artist. So the freedom is almost an automatic, unthought quality towards the world, as opposed to the existentialist choice, which is like, make the right choice.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're inauthentic. So do you see how they go together? I like the Merleau-Pontian one better as well, but I don't see how they go together.
Well, I think there's still a choice for Merleau-Ponty about putting yourself in circumstances where you can start to develop these habits, right? Like that's still a choice. Like there's still a choice there to be like, okay, I'm going to work my ass off to start to be good. I'm going to do art every day. And at first it's going to be like every single day, those early days when you're doing it, it is going to be a choice, right? Like it is going to be like a Sartrean choice because you're so uncoordinated. You're so bad at it. You have to be so deliberate with your actions that those are Sartrean choices at first. And then the further along you get, the better you get, the more automatic it becomes, the better you are at it, the more free you are, but like the less you have to think about it.
Yeah. No, I like that account because it almost brings it close to Marx. For what's good for Marx would be, you know, the free development of the human being in a well-rounded kind of way, rather than the sort of constrained, one-sided development that being a laborer under capitalism forces onto people. But then putting on my existentialist hat and thinking, I remember you saying you kind of reject absolute freedom. I would think from
like
an
metaphysical freedom. Yeah.
Well, yeah, just the way, you know, Sartre says we're absolutely free.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't like that language.
By nothing.
But then in other places, he admits that with that like our facticity limits us a whole bunch of different ways. So I maybe he's just not consistent in how he articulates it. I don't want to defend the way that Sartre articulates it again. I think I'm first and foremost a Merleau-Pontian.
Let's stick to Merleau-Ponty, and for the sake of time, if you want to reflect on it more in your presentation, Eric, but why don't we move in that direction?
I guess I just want to say one thing quickly though, which is just that I think what's intuitively appealing about the view that I presented to is that I think that even though there's not like a metaphysical account of freedom, I think when I say, I mean, maybe you guys will disagree, but when I explain, those moments when you push yourself and you can overcome something, like I think most people or almost everyone would be like, yeah, it feels really good when those things happen. So I guess I just think there's an intuitive appeal. I think it's articulating something that I think is at the core of the human experience in a way that like other accounts, I just don't think do as good a job.
But in your account, America is not the only free society in the world. So
obviously, I mean, I don't even know if they might not even be the most free.
We'll see by the end of the episode.
Yeah.
What do you got for us, Eric?
Well, I'm going to be riffing a little bit on Peirce's philosophy. I wouldn't really call it a philosophy of freedom. It's sort of part of his cosmic philosophical architecture. But freedom in Peirce, right? Okay, so that's associated with the first of his three categories, which is conveniently called firstness. I guess just generally, I would describe it as a kind of I won't steal Pills's word and say it's deflationary, but it's this interesting 19th century debate where the idea of like infinitesimals comes into play, things that are like non-zero but approaching zero. They're sort of unmeasurable, but we know it's a non-zero quantity, but it's like infinitely approaching zero. This idea of infinitesimals, it came from mathematics, from Leibniz and that. And freedom is associated with firstness, which can also mean chance or spontaneity, right? Freedom for Peirce is very, very minute. It's chance departures from law. So he doesn't see natural laws as these ironclad things that determine every little part of reality down to the last molecular movement, down to the last atomic movement. He sees constant infinitesimal departures from natural laws, right? So think about, say, the second law of thermodynamics, right? The entropy law, right? Everything moves necessarily from a state of order, maximal order, to maximal disorder. But he says he says most scientists of his day who study gases would agree that the atoms move randomly, not according to laws, but almost by chance, and that there are moments, infinitesimally small moments, where actually the particles may gather into a kind of order before then going. So the general trend is still towards disorder, but there are little moments where actually the reverse process happens. But it's infinitely quick and infinitesimally small. But for Peirce, it's the possibility of life to emerge in the universe. That's the stake of this question of either denying or accepting this sort of quantum of absolute chance or spontaneity in the universe. Is the possibility of life for Peirce. Because what does life do? Life organizes itself on a higher order than physical matter, and it gives itself structure, and it is almost like a reverse entropy kind of movement. It, maybe you say, it locally reduces entropy while universally increases it, but that still goes against the second law of thermodynamics for Peirce. So again, you'll already notice this is extremely like math and technical heavy stuff he's pulling from to construct this philosophy. But he does go into the weeds sometimes, and it gets really bogged down and difficult. But he generally stays at this more philosophical level when he's presenting these things. So that's the basic sort of outline, anyway. And so Peirce's philosophy of freedom, as I said, makes freedom sort of coincident with absolute spontaneity or chance, which he sees as an operative element in the universe, one of those three universal categories he has, right? So for Peirce, there's a little bit of a Sartrean kind of ontological story there too, where we suppose there's like an initial state of nothing, pure zero, not the nothing of negation, but just pure zero nothing. Because Peirce says negation implies a second, right? A second, something negating something else. So, but we're in the realm of, we're trying to get from pure zero to first here. So we say what immediately follows from this sort of nothing, this pure zero, is not something actual. And we don't go straight to actuality, straight to existence, but potentiality. Unrestrained, limitless potentiality becomes limited. It becomes a potential for this or that to happen. It becomes specified without yet becoming actual, right? Because to have actuality, we need secondness. We need something else. But in this realm of pure firstness, we have this limiting of a limitless freedom, of a boundless potentiality, into a freedom for potentiality of this or that. And he's arguing with the necessitarians of his day, who believe what I said earlier, that you have this initial state of the universe that operates by ironclad laws, and if you just knew everything about the initial state of the universe, you could divine everything about the future, including people, including what people are doing, thinking, and feeling. And Peirce rejects this view because in that necessitarian view, there would be no freedom, no chance spontaneity, nothing like that operative in the universe. Or at least for them, chance would just be a lack of knowledge of causes or something like that, right? It wouldn't be an actual operative element, which Peirce uses lots of words to describe it: freshness, newness, originality, which is constantly with us, right? And he has a whole load of arguments to go against that. But let's see. So the necessitarians, Peirce says, is that the state of things existing at any time, together with certain immutable laws, completely determine the state of things at every other time. Thus, given the state of the universe in its original nebula, and given the laws of mechanics, a sufficiently powerful mind could deduce from these data the precise form of every curlicue of every letter I am now writing. So that's this. He also calls that the mechanical philosophy that arose after Galileo and became very popular. By the 19th century, it was everywhere. They were materialists, they were necessitarians, they were the mechanical philosophers, and Peirce is arguing against that.
Wait, sorry. Obviously, first of all, you're at time. Second, I lost the plot. So I understood the indeterminacy part, but I don't understand which freedom is attached to. So could you maybe explain, if freedom is firstness, and this is a non-reflective decision, do I have that right?
It's not reflective or decision. It's not tied to.
No, I don't mean conscious.
Mind.
I mean like even material distinctions, making distinctions amongst other material.
Yeah. At this point, there would be distinctions would emerge between possibilities, right? So,
and is the possibilities the freedom, or is the action the freedom? That's where I got lost.
The freedom itself would be like absolute freedom, I would say, in Peirce would be associated with, boundless potentiality, right? I'll sell this by saying it's a non-anthropocentric view of freedom, right? So the freedom of the human being, the freedom of the will, is intimately tied to the freedom that Peirce sees operating cosmologically, right? So if the necessitarians deny that there is any chance spontaneity in the universe, except maybe at the beginning when things were created or originated, but after that, nothing new under the sun, then that also implies that there's no freedom for humans either, right? Our freedom is a quantum or a microcosm of the cosmic freedom that Peirce is talking about, right? So if you have free will, there must be freedom in the universe, to put it in a terrible, crude way. Yeah, there must be an actual operative, I guess, not objective freedom. I don't want to use that language, but yeah, absolute pure freedom would be that sort of starting point between 0 and 1.
Victor, do you have any questions?
I mean, I think that, I don't know. I think, like, I guess my kind of existential mood, given that that's what I've been reading, and, makes me kind of, my ears perk up at the kind of like non-anthropocentric kind of thing. Because I guess, like, for me, it's like thinking about freedom only makes sense in terms of how it relates to human concerns. I guess it's like, how is it going to help me figure out, like, make sense of my ambiguous life? And I guess when you kind of look at it from like this sort of like non-human perspective, it just feels like it's like no longer in the realm of human, of like helping me make sense of my life. And maybe we're just talking about, maybe it's like two levels of description, right? Like one is kind of like to put it crudely, kind of like abstractly philosophical, and then the other is like self-help, to put it crudely, or something like that. Right? Because it's just like from kind of like an existential like self-help, like I'm trying to make sense of the ambiguity of like the weirdness of being alive. And then it's like we're talking about like, you know, molecules and particles, and I don't know, almost seems like a crudely like building up to this account. It's like, well, how does that help me, you know, make sense of my life? So I don't know. I just wondered what you thought about that. It's not necessarily a criticism, but I'm just curious. It's maybe like a meta question about like, what's the point of describing freedom from in one abstract way versus another abstract way?
Why did you pick this one?
Yeah, that's maybe an even simpler way of asking that question.
Yeah, well, the simple answer is because I'm familiar with Peirce, and it was an easier choice for me. The more difficult answer is because on the point of that, I think Peirce has a good argument on the point of that anthropocentric concern, because you know, this idea that there is an element of chance in the universe, freedom, not necessarily just human freedom, but freedom in the sense of departing from ironclad laws, right? So this is a hypothesis, right? Peirce says this. This is something that must be the case for there to be, say, life, for there to be a human being, for you to be conscious, right? For there to be consciousness in the universe at all, right? So it's a generalization from within experience and only provisional knowledge, right? Our knowledge is always derived from experience and trials and encountering the world and thinking about it. And it's always provisional. We can't be certain about anything. But in the necessitarian philosophy, in order to get around this and say there is certainty, you know, everything is determined ahead of time and everything is certain, everything is etched in stone. And the fact that we, you know, are still surprised by things even today with our like amazing knowledge is just our own ignorance. It has nothing to do with any fundamental principle of chance in the universe. It's just human ignorance explains it. And so Peirce is trying to counter that argument by saying, well, yeah, of course, like our knowledge is incomplete, and but you know, all these other things, like if everything was, you know, there in the beginning, everything was put into the universe and nothing new under the sun, everything's determined by ironclad laws, then how is there, say, the great variety of the universe, right? He says, you know, the universe, nature is full of this insane variety, and things actually seem to be moving towards more variety and more complexity, not less. So if the necessitarian account is true, then we should actually be seeing a movement towards uniformity and a movement towards homogeneity. But what we actually see is uniformity constantly punctuated by divergences and variety. And what we actually see is a good measure of heterogeneity. It doesn't seem like the universe is tending towards homogeneity and the sameness of all things. And for Peirce, laws are the result of this evolution from this state of indeterminacy towards a determinacy, right? But if you trace laws back, they become more indeterminate and less ironclad. So, and those laws continue to operate. They're not erased by the more determinate laws. That's the best I can sort of do with that.
Fair enough. I want to hear the deflation.
I have questions about the implications of that, but you talk too long, so
I know.
I can't ask them. Okay, yeah, if we're going to get to the end of this, I got to start. I have called it deflationary. If it's probably on the anti-philosophy side of philosophy, which is a technical definition, I'm not against philosophy, but this take is. So I'll begin with the obvious before we enter my little research program, my in-depth research program, which is to say that freedom is a word. And more than that, freedom is a sign. And with most words, the best way is to consider it semiotically. And it is kind of deflationary because freedom is one of our loftiest words. It's one of the loftiest words we have. We worship it. We agree with it. We all gather around it, as we said before. So I began by typing the word freedom into Instagram just to see what popped up. Because
that's fun.
This would demonstrate some degree of freedom. Of course, I saw tits right away. Some ads for being a day trader. Some AI images of Biden giving Messi a medal, which I don't know why they were AI because I think that really happened. He got the Medal of Freedom. An Argentinian soccer player got the American Medal of Freedom. So that didn't help much. Or did it? Then I went to etymology. So I looked at the Bible because, Western civilization. I looked up Aeschylus. And freedom appears, I think, in both those sources. I found like 20 instances or so. Freedom appears virtually always the same in those sources in the Greek terminology, which is it's opposed to slavery. And most of the time, I'd say over 90% of the time, it's opposed to literal slavery. So if you're a free man, that means you're not a slave. If you're a slave, you're not a free man. The free man has freedom, and the slave does not. So it does extend metaphorically, especially later on, like in first century Greek as opposed to 3rd century BC Greek. It does extend, and we find a lot of this in the Bible. The Greek term, what did you say before? You said it, Eric, as eleutheria, I think it is.
Yeah.
So in the Bible,
something like that.
Eleutheria, it's the name of a festival when slaves are given special privileges. Some are set free if they've done some good service. And it's associated with a goddess. It might be the name of a goddess. I didn't go that far in. But in the Bible, by 300 years after the term first appears to us, it's used metaphorically. So you're free, not in a sense of not being a slave, but in a metaphorical sense, you're no longer a slave to the law, or you're no longer a slave to sin. And I found this interesting in terms of freedom, because freedom at first just means something very concrete. It's a designation for a certain type of person who lives in your society. And even in the first 200 years, we can see it drifting to become more metaphorized. And of course, by the time we get to the English language and the word freedom really explodes at the end of the 18th century for the reasons of probably America. I'm not sure. This is my other bit of research. I did Google Ngram. It explodes at the end of the 18th century, and freedom means now, today, all the things that, of course, America does. Freedom of speech, that one makes the headlines. So I'll skip to the end here before I justify how I got there. I'm going to say that freedom at this point is a floating signifier. It means whatever the interpreter wants it to mean. It can mean whatever the person appealing to it wants it to mean. And usually in the same conversation, you get what the term means. Freedom of speech means something quite particular today that has nothing to do with its original use. But I noticed another thing is that we arrive at a certain new duality where freedom always has a flip side, and the flip side of that freedom is restriction. So I heard a little bit of this in Victor's presentation, but I thought it'd be useful to get the very basic freedoms that we claim to possess out of the way, which is the freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of expression, of speech and the press, freedom of assembly, and there's another one, freedom of association. I think that's different from assembly. So all these freedoms we call them freedoms, but they do not have positive content because they are actually negations. They are restrictions on the state. That's changed a little bit, but every freedom is its flip side, which is someone else is restricted from doing something to you. The state cannot compel your religion, punish you for speech, or break up your assembly. And I think this is more than just playing a word game here, because each time we move freedom 100 years forward in the future, from the Greek definition that's translated into English, the Proto-Germanic word free basically means the same as the Greek one, which is you're not a slave. But the reason I think this works so well as a floating signifier is that it doesn't have positive content. Now, your version, Victor, I think, and maybe Eric's as well, did give some positive content to the word freedom. But I think the reason the word is so flexible outside of philosophy is that it just relies on whatever opposing version you don't like. So freedom becomes the opposite of what you do not like. So freedom, for this reason, for the floating signifier reason, is perfect as an advertising term. I'm glad that you brought it up. Car commercials, love freedom. Drug commercials, love freedom. Vacation commercials. And one of the first major campaigns of the 20th century in advertising was Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who started advertising cigarettes to women by calling them torches of freedom. And he paid women to go out into parades and smoke, and they were expressing their femininity by smoking. And this example, I think, is true to what freedom actually means. It's not a cynical deployment. I think this is more in line with what the word freedom actually means when it is used today. We have a bunch more examples that I won't have time to go into, but of course, Operation Iraqi Freedom, freedom fries. This word really just means whatever anyone wants it to, which means the opposite of the bad people that you do not like. So Christians, liberals, Americans, they all have their opposite term. Like Protestants love freedom more than Catholics, I think. So you have Catholics and Protestants, their freedom to practice their religion with their own Bible. You have tyrants for liberals. You have communists for capitalists. You have the USSR for the free world. Muslims for the free world after 9/11. You have the patriarchy for feminists, the left for the right, and the right for the left. Everyone gets to point at someone else to say, that is not freedom, and therefore I have it, basically by a process of negation. So to boil it down, got to skip some stuff. I actually do see, I said this was a little bit an anti-philosophical definition, but I see in here also what most philosophers most of the time have said about freedom, namely that the philosopher saying the word freedom is the one who's free, and their counterpart, the masses, they are not free because they're beholden to their herd instincts, and they just flow down the stream of life without any awareness. That's why I asked both of you whether your definition that you were borrowing needed to have people who are aware of it or not. Because I think philosophers fall into the same camp here as advertisers. So, in sum, that the lofty view of freedom is just big theatrics. It's one of the best. It's kind of one of the only terms that can be used like this, where anyone who hears it hears what they want, which is to be on the good side of a distinction. And the distinction is up to the hearer more than even the speaker. So you get to be good. At the same time, you also need to point out the designation of who's bad here. Nazis, Muslims, liberals, fascists, communists, whoever is the unfree group, they are the one that makes you free by a process of negation. And it's kind of perfect. So you can see it in religion. God will make you free. Self-help. Your true self is your free self. Jingoism, we've seen that deployed. Politics. And that is what freedom means to me.
Good. Do you think, can you think of an example? Because I think you're right about this, especially about like the fact that it very rarely has positive content. That seems right to me. And it's usually like the absence of some kind of something that one side describes as being a constraint on seeming choices or freedom. But I guess like, I wonder if you're underselling the fact that that is a pretty consistent structure, that it's like a perceived, because I guess the question I was going to ask is do you have an example of like freedom being used where it's unrelated to like accusing something or some group of constraining choices, right? Because like in the case of like, even with the cigarette ad, right? It's like torches of freedom because it's like women should have the choice to smoke. They should be, and it's like maybe culture is telling them that like women, you know, it's, I don't know what the cultural milieu was. I wasn't alive back then, but I'm assuming the implication of that ad is that like some people were maybe saying that like smoking is unfeminine, right? So
yeah,
they're saying, no,
they thought it was tawdry and that harlots would smoke in public.
Sure. Because I guess like if it always shows up in cases where, you know, one side is saying, oh, this other thing that people are saying or this cultural norm is actually constraining your choices. And in that sense, it's negative, right? Because it's saying like, be free from that thing that is telling you not to do that thing. Isn't there more of isn't it more consistent than just that it's like literally any floating, like a floating signifier that could mean anything? Like I'm with you on the negative content and like a lack of positive content, but I just wonder if, I don't know, do you have an example?
Well, the way that it's used as opposed to the opposition to slavery, because slavery is a very like forcible, literal restriction. But even in the case that you described, Torches of Freedom, there's no one telling women that they can't smoke. It's just kind of looked down upon. So the imposition is the person's conscience, we would have said in old terms. And this is the same with freedom of speech today. Freedom of speech means I get to do a Heil Hitler salute. And if you say anything bad about me after that, then you're impinging upon my freedom of speech. So there are no real restraints that are being, well, I shouldn't say that. Often there are real restraints that are being responded to, you know, like part of the justification for invading Afghanistan was they're locking their women in burqas or things like that. But most often the freedom just means there should be no consequences to what I do at all. There should be no social response to me doing what I want. Even when you're already free to do what you want, you just might face some consequences for it.
Well, that's where I think maybe I'm not, I guess it does feel like, but cultural norms are perceived, I think, as a constraint, aren't they? Like, sure, like physically, like materially, like they're not actually a limit, but I guess like norms do have a weight to them that I think like does to some extent seem to interfere with freedom. I don't know, like the way that people.
Well,
I don't know, like
what
my
I would
brother.
say with freedom is like, what more do you want though? Like you are free to do the thing.
But you want the norm to change. Like, so I don't know, like my brother, for example, he's like in a polyamorous relationship and like he enjoys like shocking people kind of, but like, you know, like, but the way that people tense up when they like, you know, when he's talking about like the benefits of it or whatever, like there's a weight to that. There's a weight that like it narrows the perceived field of possibilities for people, right? They like where it's like, so like the fact that I think like cultural norms do sort of have a kind of weight to them. And I don't know, like, I don't know. I mean, I don't entirely, like, I mostly agree with you. I just wonder whether there's some kind of like a trivialization of like the weight of cultural norms as constraining freedom. Because I think that's more than the way that you're, in my opinion, at least, I feel like it has more of a weight than just like, well, you can do it if you want. Like, I don't know, like it's call out culture online. Like, sure, people could say whatever they want, but there's going to be consequences. And like the awareness of those consequences does kind of subjectively it does make people think twice. It does make people feel not comfortable. I don't know. That seems like a constraint to me.
Well, I don't disagree that it is a constraint, but if you're calling for freedom of speech, but what you mean is I want people to be nice to me on Twitter. What do you want?
Sure.
You want the law to change so that people can't call you a dumbass?
Well, I think you can have opinions on both sides, like, or at two levels, right? So like, obviously those people who say I want freedom of speech, well, it's like, obviously legally you already have it. So like, you're an idiot if like you think that you don't. But I mean, I think you could make a different kind of argument. You could just be like, people shouldn't be mad about this because it's like, it's a stupid cultural norm to like be mad about whatever X thing. And then we could be like, well, that's stupid.
But it works, right?
Just...
So my main point would be it works. If you say my freedom of speech is being repressed because people were mean to me, then other people will agree with you. And this maintains like a not a pretend imaginary force.
I mean, sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't, but yeah.
Yeah, it borrows from a social substance that is definitely real. But still, the form of freedom, the use of freedom, is still to create a distinction between bad things and myself.
I mean, that's that part of it I totally agreed with. Yeah, that part I totally agree with. Okay. Eric?
Well, yeah, well, is this thing on? I would ask, well, if I'm getting it right and your thesis is kind of just like freedom is just a word, it's a sign, it's a floating signifier, it's empty of content, it kind of just is a positively emotionally charged word that's just convenient to deploy in situations where you feel like you're not getting what you want, and you're saying it has no content, but what it really means is just the common sense version of the freedom to do or get what you want. And then I guess all the classic complaints, doesn't this just lead to relativism? And what would be the difference in any of those cases? Instead of saying you're cramping my freedom, you say you're preventing my destiny from coming to fruition, right? You could just take out the word freedom and put any other positively charged word there. You're preventing my fate from being fulfilled. You are destroying my fortune, which is just to say, if it's just a question of words, then why is the popular way more important, or why is the common sense version more important than Sartre's definition of freedom, for example? And how do we decide sort of what freedom is and who's right, as opposed to just, freedom is just a question of verbiage and arranging the facts to suit your goals, or just switching out language,
Well, I don't know what you mean by facts, because I think it's expressive of the use of the term. I don't think it's expressive of a fact. So our definitions are in conflict with each other because yours definitely has a factual basis. But based on your definition, the term freedom fries doesn't make any sense. And based on my definition, freedom fries makes perfect sense.
Right. But, if you're like in terms of a fact, right? Okay. So you do something, you buy those freedom fries and you eat them and you feel sick afterwards. And you look back on that decision and you say, could I have done otherwise? Was that a free decision I made? The fact is that I bought those freedom fries and they made me sick. That's the fact. The question of freedom is, by an effort of the will, could I have done otherwise? Or in every case, would I have made the same decision? Right? That would be the question of freedom as a fact. And you can just say, no, I would have made that decision anyway because I was hungry. I was fated to make it. like in Sartre, you can just shirk responsibility if you want to.
I'm not concerned with the eating or the purchasing of freedom fries. I'm concerned with the fact of the freedom fries, because they are called freedom fries.
Well, I mean, a fact isn't something that's happened, but the fact of the existence of freedom fries, well, okay, call them what you want. They're French fries. They're not freedom fries. But
but
in that case, it just
France
seems like
France refused to join the coalition of the willing, so they are no longer free.
right. So in this case, freedom is just an arbitrary sort of sound that is actually bound up with a kind of like geopolitical history or a cultural history and has no meaning in itself.
It does have meaning. It's how you are not the thing that you dislike.
It's like an identity kind of decision.
Yes. So the context of your freedom depends on who you are disliking or declaring unfree at the time.
Okay.
And I think,
all right,
if I can extrapolate from here, we're having a lot of problems with the term freedom, because if you have the USSR there, then we can all be Americans around the same totem of freedom together, because we're all not the USSR. And they're trying to do that with, or they tried to do that with Iraq and Afghanistan. They're trying to do it with Iran and China still, but it doesn't have the same bite, I don't think. People are not accepting it. So then they turn onto the people that call them out on Twitter and say they are the ones who are unfree. So having a unifying totem like this is socially significant. I do think the shift is like symptomatic of prospects for future employment, things like that. But still, the totem falling apart is it's nothing to scoff at, I think.
How do you think your deflationary account connects to my existentialist account? Do you think there's inconsistency? There's one sense when I was listening to you talk where I thought one way in which they could be consistent is like, I think that the existentialists would be similarly like, I don't know, judgmental or like similarly dismissive of people who are like, who are complaining about not having freedom, right? Because they'd be like, well, you do have a choice, actually. You could do that. You just have to be aware of what the consequences are going to be. So, but that's at least one way. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I related to it because it has this long history, and of course the Greeks were not saying the word freedom. This is a Proto-Germanic term, but it generally has the same cognate across languages. I know it's not the same exact root, but the same situational root, which is in a world that includes slavery. But I liked your Merleau Ponty description that describes the elevation or the satisfaction, and I don't even think it needs to necessarily be called freedom to still have that same truth to it. When you change something or fix something or something's going wrong in your life and you change your habit and you realize that you did that, even if it's not called freedom, there is a sort of euphoria in that. And I think the feeling of using the word freedom for yourself has a similar euphoria. But yeah, I would say my definition is more dependent on the social situation, whereas yours could be done alone in your room. If you decide
it's totally subjective. Yeah.
I guess my criticism would just be kind of the standard saying, okay, so the cultural linguistic approach is relativistic and freedom is just what you want it to be. So, the Muslims are right that the women wearing bikinis on California beach aren't free because they have to display their bodies, and the Americans are right about the Muslim women because they're not free because they have to cover their bodies. And whether who's right about freedom is a question of well, it's not a question of truth or falsity at all. It's just a relative to that culture, like truth. It's whatever you want it to be. And that, that obviously leaves that relativism problem, because then it's like, okay, well, definitely you can't build an ethics on this because ethics can't really be through and through relativistic. It has to have some sort of, I don't know, common basis of understanding between people. But the other thing I would just say from a more Peircean...
Can I respond to that? Because I just say,
Yeah, sure.
Relativism, not my problem. I'm trying to find the meaning of language in its use. In this sense, yeah, like I just described, I know the thing that Victor's talking about. Do we call it freedom? Well, Merleau Ponty does, or whatever the French version of that is, liberty. But we also have to account for freedom fries. So I wanted to account for both of those things. And that doesn't mean that all meanings are all relative to each other, but I think language is relative to itself. So I wouldn't even take that as a criticism.
Well, other people would say, no, language isn't a closed system. It deals with the world, just like everything else. But I'd say, yeah, okay. So then furthermore, there's no responsibility connected with this concept of freedom either, because, it's not my problem, as you said. So there's no responsibility there either. So it's not very existentialist by Sartre's standards. But I was just going to say, from the Peircean perspective, then, we're really just stuck at the first grade of clarity, because the third grade of clarity, the pragmatic grade of clarity, is consider what effects which might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have, then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. In other words, the difference that makes a difference. And if freedom is just a sort of, you're stuck on this first definitional level and you can't really agree on the definition, then it just seems like then freedom really just makes no difference. It's a difference, the difference between freedom and necessity is a difference that makes no difference, and we should probably just stop talking about it entirely. It would be kind of the case of a pragmatist, getting that third level of clarity. When Peirce gives that example of, a diamond appears, it's never discovered by anybody, it's never touched, it's never altered, it just sits there in its little bed of cotton until it burns up. Was it hard? Is that diamond hard? Well, it was never tested. It was never scratched. It really makes no difference whether you call it hard or soft. It would make no difference in my life or my future conduct, whatever these words mean, because they have no fixed meaning. That would be the sort of pragmatist, maybe, if I make an attempt at parroting a pragmatic, a Peircean pragmatic criticism, that would be it.
I think there is some connection between your two definitions that's more life helpful. Because if Merleau Ponty's account is accurate, and I think it is accurate, but Merleau Ponty wouldn't have a problem with freedom being an emergent property. I don't think he would go all the way down to matter, but he'd be okay with going down to biology, maybe.
Yeah, probably.
But we're coming at this from different perspectives. While I'm saying that the meaning of language is in its use, that's not something I'm saying cynically. That's something I believe. So if you just called the freedom of particles something different, that would solve the problem of the freedom fries, which is glaring here. But if you change the word, it wouldn't be the same type of word or same type of totem that is so easy to get people riled up about. We have half of a country south of us that's extremely concerned with freedom of speech that has not changed in any legal sense at all for 200-300 years. So
Yeah, it's interesting comparing the different perspectives. Yeah, Peirce has a foot, it seems to me, in both the sort of philosophy of language side and almost like a proto-existentialist kind of take on it. And I guess the only concrete difference with Peirce is he would say that associational element you're talking about, associating freedom with the word freedom with, I don't know, freedom fries or freedom this or whatever kinds of freedom, that mental association is made possible by this element of chance. It's like within the necessitarian account, we just preserve this kernel of freedom, chance, spontaneity that's constantly operative in the universe. And for Peirce, he sees that as this like this germinating kernel where mind emerges and arbitrary associations between things become possible because of this moment. And then your account becomes possible on this basis because mind makes associations between disconnected events and, you know, builds them up into sense and meaning for our lives. And I mean, it's a long road to anywhere from there, but that's where Peirce kind of starts.
I also want to just say it wasn't completely arbitrary. Like, the thing that freedom always has is a split meaning. Freedom for you is restriction for someone else. And I think that's a little more interesting than being purely arbitrary.
Yeah, I chose the wrong word there. It shouldn't be arbitrary because that's like sort of a technical word from Saussure. Yeah, no, like it would be a meaningful connection because it's something you've experienced together. Like when, you know, like Pavlov's dog, right? Pavlov's dog rings the bell, gets the food, ring the bell, get the food. Eventually an association is created between those two things. And all you have to do is ring the bell and the dog slobbers everywhere. You don't even need to present the food, right? Right. Yeah. So it's not arbitrary, obviously. It has to be in some experiential, concrete thing happening like that. And then the mind learns and makes associations. So they are, yeah, arbitrary was the wrong word. You're right.
I don't even want to say wrong word. I just meant to say there's a consistent element there. But anyway, that's I think that's good enough for now. That went kind of well. We might have to, it's worth doing. I like bringing something to the table, but maybe we need to give ourselves more time to discuss it and to really ask these questions, because we're at we're at time and there's still more to say.
Yeah. And the feedback will be important.
All right. So we haven't really solved anything. We know what it means. I gotta say I'm partial to Victor's self-help definition, because it's self-help not to be demeaning, but it's actually like the most, I can experience myself as free and connect myself to a project and it feels good. Whereas you can use freedom in my sense to make yourself feel good, but it's stupid. I'll be honest. It's stupid.
But I'll be curious to what the listeners think. I'm obviously a bit of a stand for existentialism and phenomenology, but
it's potentially clarity through contrast and mutual friendly criticism, which is the best kind of clarity.
Yeah.
And I'd like to investigate what you mean by non-arbitrary language, if there could be such a thing. But we can't get there today.
Do it now. We can't do it now.
Nope. Eric.
Nope.
All right.
Nope.
He's thinking about it. He's thinking about it.
The story goes back to the ancient Greek day.
Till next time, guys.
Next
Later.
time. Yeah.